My name is Father Antonio. I am 58 years old and I have served for more than 3 decades in a small parish in the interior of Pennsylvania. My life was dedicated to faith, to the teachings of Christ, to the Eucharist, to humble service to others. I have always loved preaching about repentance, God's mercy, and the transformative power of prayer. I grew up believing that the mission of a priest was to protect the truth, to keep the light of Christ burning in the souls of the faithful. But nothing prepared me for what happened to me that morning. I had just finished a homily on the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." That verse echoed in my heart, and I didn't know why, until everything went dark. I'm not here just to tell another testimony. What I'm going to relate is something that goes beyond life, beyond death, beyond human understanding, a moment of encounter with the sacred, a dive into the presence of Jesus. And with him came a message, a warning, an urgent call, and this call involves Pope Francis himself. Jesus showed me something deep, something that affects the spiritual structure of the Church as we know it. He spoke to me with love, but also with authority. And even as a man trained in obedience, I found myself confronted with a higher commandment: tell my people. This story is not for the weak of faith. It is for those who seek truth, who pray for direction, who want to understand the signs of the times. If you are someone who cries out in prayer, "Lord, what is happening to the world?" then maybe, just maybe, this message is for you too. Jesus' words still echo in my mind. The light still shines, but many are looking at the shadow. I felt scared, but I also felt peace, and I know I need to obey, because this message is not just for bishops, for cardinals, for church councils. It is for everyone who kneels before the cross and says, "Speak, Lord, your servant listens." What I saw in that moment between life and death changed everything I believed about ministry, about authority, about the time we are living in. Perhaps you feel in your spirit that something is happening, that we are in a time of profound spiritual transition. Perhaps your prayer in recent days has been, "Lord, reveal the truth." And now, you are here, not by chance. This video is for those looking for more than answers. It is for those who want revelation. It is for those who feel that God still moves, still speaks, still sends his servants with urgent messages. And yes, it's about the future of faith. It's about the Church. It's about the Pope. But most of all, it's about Jesus. And what he said to me, "It will shake your soul." From a very young age, I felt God's calling. It wasn't one of those sudden conversions or supernatural visions that push someone toward faith. My path was built with silence, with dedication, with discipline. I grew up listening to my mother's voice in prayer and the firmness of my father who, despite being strict, believed that life was more than flesh and bones. When I entered the seminary, I was absolutely certain. I wanted to serve. I wanted to be an instrument. I wanted my voice to bring people closer to God. And during all these years, I tried with all my might to live in accordance with the teachings of the gospel. I spent 3 decades as a priest in a small parish in rural Pennsylvania. No luxury, no stages or fame. Just a simple altar, benches worn out by time, and faithful who looked thirsty for answers. Answers about life, about pain, about the reasons for the tragedies that, from time to time, seemed to not spare even the most saintly. There, in that little temple, I became the counselor of many, the shoulder of someone who mourns a loss, the prayer of those who needed healing, the hug of those who wanted to feel that God was still listening. I have always been conservative. I have always believed that tradition carries deep truths, like roots that cannot be uprooted. I defended the unity of the Church with all my being. I obeyed my superiors. He followed the documents, the rites, the dogmas. But what if I told you that even so there was a void, an inner silence that made me question myself without ever having the courage to verbalize it? You know that feeling that on the outside everything is fine, but inside something doesn't fit. Sometimes between one mass and another, between counseling and a funeral, I would find myself in silent prayer asking, "Lord, are we still on the right path?" And that tore me apart. Because how could I, Father, question the direction of Peter's boat? Who was I to doubt something so great, so divine, so sacred? But the truth is that many of those listening to me now know exactly what I'm talking about. How many times have you felt like something is out of place? That faith is still alive, but the environment around it seems asleep. How many times have you looked at the attitudes of some religious leaders and asked yourself, is this really what Christ taught? I'm not here to point fingers. I don't judge. But I know there is a restlessness in the hearts of many sincere Christians, and it doesn't come from rebellion. It comes from zeal. Zeal for Jesus. Zeal for the gospel. Zeal for the truth. Even though I was faithful to the liturgy, even though I recited the Psalms by heart, even though I fasted and confessed regularly, I felt that there was a distance between what we preached and what we actually lived, and it started to slowly eat away at me. I saw changes happening in the church, some good, some that made me frown, changes that often came with the stamp of modernity, but sounded like dangerous concessions. I remember one night in particular. I had finished praying the rosary. He was alone in the tabernacle with the lights in the nave turned off, only the altar candle lit, and there, kneeling, I spoke out loud for the first time what was trapped inside me. Lord, please show me the truth. If I am blind, make me see. If I am lost, bring me back. My voice echoed through the emptiness of the church, and I felt a chill run down my spine. At that moment, something began to change. It was not at that moment that the experience happened, but it was there that everything started to move. It was as if heaven had heard a prayer that I myself had tried to stifle for years, and perhaps you who are watching me now, perhaps you have also prayed similar prayers. Maybe you're tired of the shallow answers. Maybe you feel like something is coming. Or perhaps you are just seeking confirmation of what you already feel in your spirit. Have you ever had the feeling that the spiritual world is closer than we imagine? That the signs are everywhere, waiting to be noticed? That the truth is knocking on the door, but many are afraid to open it? I understand. I lived it. And I want to tell you everything. Because what happened to me wasn't just a supernatural experience. It was a calling, a revelation, a mission that began precisely when my faith seemed to walk in silence, when I least expected to hear such a clear answer. And that's why you need to keep watching, because from here the story changes. But before I continue, think with me. What if everything you know about faith, tradition, and spiritual authority was about to be confronted by a heavenly truth? Would you be ready to listen? Because that's exactly what happened to me, and what comes now is just the beginning. It was a Sunday morning, like so many others. The church was full. The faithful positioned themselves on the benches with that reverent silence that precedes the sacred. I wore my white tunic, already positioned before the altar. Mass had started a few minutes ago. It was a day to proclaim the word, to celebrate the Eucharist, to renew in each heart the hope that comes from the resurrection. I felt strange since dawn, but I chose not to care. I woke up with a slight dizziness, pressure in my chest that I thought was anxiety or tiredness, nothing that a dedicated priest wasn't used to ignoring. As I recited the words of the rite, a sudden dizziness took over my body. The view darkened. The surrounding voices began to recede as if I were entering a tunnel. The cup slipped from my hands, and in the next moment everything disappeared. It was as if time had been ripped away from me. The altar, the people, the light of the temple, everything disappeared. The silence that enveloped me was dense, absolute. They say it was a sudden faint, but those who witnessed the moment say that my body fell in a strange way, as if it had been turned off. One believer ran up to me, then another. Panic took over the church. They called the ambulance. While the paramedics tried to revive my body outside, a crowd of faithful knelt and prayed in tears. They said, "Lord, don't take him. Not now. But man's time is limited." And there that morning, mine had run out. At the hospital, the medical reports were clear. Cardiac arrest. My heart had stopped for about 8 minutes. 8 minutes of clinical death. 8 minutes in which, according to scientific protocols, there was no more brain activity. 8 minutes in which I was no longer in this world. And here is where the inexplicable begins. While the doctors were racing against time to bring me back, trying to reverse the condition with shock and medication, something much deeper was happening beyond their understanding, because although my body was there, inert, cold, silent, my consciousness was not. It's difficult to find human words to describe what I felt, but I remember the exact feeling. First, a lightness, as if an anchor had been ripped from my chest. I felt like I was being pulled out of myself, up, away. It was as if I were floating. There was no pain, there was no fear, there was peace, a peace that cannot be compared to anything I have ever felt on earth. At the same time, I noticed everything that was happening around me. I heard the screams, the machines being turned on, the sounds of footsteps rushing through the hospital. But these sounds were far away, like echoes of a world that no longer belonged to me. What caught my attention was that, even without a body, I felt it. I felt people's energy, the anguish of doctors, the desperate faith of an elderly woman kneeling at the emergency room door. I knew her name. It was Donna Lucia. Every day she sat in the same church pew, always at the first Mass on Sunday. And there she was, begging God for my life, saying, "Lord, he didn't finish his mission." And maybe she was right. At that exact moment, my body was motionless on the stretcher. My heartbeat was still absent. My eyes were closed. My skin was cold. But something beyond the flesh was active. And that was when spiritual reality began to reveal itself in a way that no theological reading, no philosophical treatise, no sermon could ever prepare me to understand. The body lay, but the soul was being led. And there began something that would completely change everything I believed. Can you imagine this? Have you ever stopped to think about what happens in the seconds when life escapes us? What's between the last breath and the first heartbeat on the other side? Science has a name for this: clinical death. But I tell you, it's much more than that. It's a portal, a watershed. It is where the veil is torn and the curtains of the visible open to the eternal. And you? Have you ever felt something similar? A moment when it felt like being between two worlds? Have you ever had a near-death experience or know someone who has? Have you ever woken up from a faint feeling like you saw something no one else saw? Comment below, share what you felt, because what comes now goes beyond what the eyes can see. What came next cannot be explained in human words. And even now, as I tell this story, I lack vocabulary that translates what I experienced. It was as if I was in a place outside of time and space. My body was no longer my body. I didn't step on any ground, I didn't breathe air, but I still existed, fully conscious, intensely present. The feeling was one of absolute lightness, as if I had left all the pain, burdens, and obligations behind. I saw myself climbing, but without any effort, and as I rose, a peace came over me. It wasn't the peace of silence, it was a living peace, which filled me completely. It was as if I was coming home, as if everything I had been looking for years of prayer and searching was finally there. All around, an intense light, but not a light that blinds, but rather a light that heals, a light that has color, but that no palette can reproduce. A living light that seemed to breathe with me. Everything was surrounded by this luminous presence, a presence that did not speak, but communicated. And then I realized it wasn't just light, it was someone. It was a real presence, so real that I felt her love before I even saw her. My spirit trembled. My heart was filled with reverent fear, but also with a love that completely disarmed me. And that's when he appeared. Not like the sacred images we have in churches, not like Baroque paintings or ancient stained glass. He did not wear a blue robe or carry a cross. But I knew without the slightest doubt that it was Jesus. His presence is unmistakable. He doesn't need to say who he is. The Spirit recognizes. Every spiritual cell of my being bowed. Your eyes, oh, your eyes. They weren't just eyes. They were portals to something eternal. In them, there was love and justice. There was mercy and truth. There was fire and tenderness. It was as if I was in front of the Creator himself, and at the same time in front of the most intimate of friends. He looked at me as if he saw beyond the flesh, as someone who knows every thought, every sin, every hidden tear. And yet, there was no condemnation. There was love. A love that embarrassed me. A love so pure that it made me cry without stopping. I fell to my knees, even though there were no knees there, because the soul knows when it is in the presence of the Holy One. And then he spoke. The voice of Jesus is not heard with the ears, it echoes in the soul. Each word came with strength, with the weight of eternity. And the first thing he said was, "My church is being hurt from within." It was like a sword entering my chest, not out of pain but out of revelation. I understood. He didn't talk about the physical structure. He didn't just talk about doctrine. He didn't talk about cathedrals. He spoke of hearts, of leaders, of ministries that strayed from their purpose. He continued, Tell my people, return to your first love. Those words still burn in me to this day. Back to first love, the essence, the simplicity, genuine repentance, the pure gospel, the cross, the brokenness. And then he said something that shocked me. I didn't expect to hear that. I didn't even imagine. Francisco needs to listen. There is an urgent call, and he knows it. I didn't understand everything at that moment, but I felt the weight of responsibility. It wasn't criticism, it wasn't an attack, it wasn't judgment. It was a warning, a direct warning, a heavenly calling to a human authority, a reminder that everyone, even those highest in the hierarchy of earth, are under the authority of heaven. At that moment, he raised his hand, and before my eyes, scenes began to appear, not like a movie, but like spiritual visions, living images. I saw veils being torn like curtains falling one after the other. Behind them, hidden truths were revealed, hidden sins, corruptions disguised as holiness, intentions stained with vanity. But I also saw pure hearts being lifted up, simple people receiving light, a faithful remnant rising up in prayer. Jesus' sadness was deep, but it was the sadness of someone who loves so much that they still wait, from those who still believe in transformation. I felt everything. I felt his love for the church, but I also felt the regret, the weight, the urgency. At that moment, a responsibility began to arise within me. It was as if something was being sealed in my spirit. He didn't force me to do anything, but his words made it clear I had a mission, a message, a testimony I could not keep, and that terrified me. I knew what happened to those who dared to say what many didn't want to hear, but there, in his presence, fear had no place, just the truth. Have you ever had a moment in your life when you felt like God really saw you, that he knew exactly what you carried inside? Have you ever felt like there was something more waiting for you, something that went beyond the walls of religion, beyond what your eyes could see? If you felt this, then stay with me, because what he showed me later changed everything, and I need to tell you, but only if you are ready, because the truth does not comfort those who live by appearance. It transforms those who are willing to be broken for love. The feeling of returning to my body was as strange as it was indescribable. It was as if I were being pulled back into matter with an invisible, almost violent force. The heat of that light faded, giving way to the metallic cold of the hospital room. The soft sound of Jesus' presence was replaced by hurried voices, appliance alarms, footsteps running in the hallway. My eyes opened with difficulty, as if they had been sealed for centuries. The brightness of the fluorescent lamps blinded me for a few seconds, and everything around me seemed to spin. A nurse noticed and shouted, "He's woken up." Immediately, doctors crowded around me, muttering technical words that I barely understood, but none of that mattered. Nothing, because within me there was an echo that resounded like thunder in the spirit. "Tell my people." This phrase, simple and powerful, was repeated like a mantra that never stopped. It was as if it were embedded in my soul, like a living fire that does not consume but transforms. I could feel the weight of those words, and I knew they weren't just for me, they were for the world. But along with the light, the weight of doubt also returned. A subtle shadow began to grow within my heart. What if I had imagined all that? What if it was a delirium caused by clinical death? What if my mind, in desperation, had fabricated that encounter because of my love for Jesus? This internal struggle was more intense than any I had ever faced. It wasn't just between faith and reason. It was between obedience and fear, between mission and self-preservation, between the call of Christ and the silence required by a structure that often fears the supernatural. During the days following my release from the hospital, I avoided any contact with the media or people I was too close to. I didn't tell anyone anything. I isolated myself in the room of the rectory, turning off the lights, closing the windows, as if the world outside could distract me from what I had experienced. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that silence would not be an option. It was then that I started writing. I took an old black-covered notebook, the kind we use for quick notes or parish records, and I started to write down every detail of the experience. I didn't write as a priest. I wrote like a man, like a son, as a servant. Every sentence Jesus spoke to me, every sensation, every vision, every emotion, everything was recorded precisely. It was as if my hand couldn't write on its own. The words just flowed. And as I wrote, I cried. He cried like a child. Because reliving that was as sacred as it was terrifying. With each page written, however, the battle within me grew. Doubt whispered that I might be ridiculed, that I could be accused of heresy, that perhaps the church itself would silence me, that people wouldn't believe, that they would call me a lunatic, a liar, a fanatic. But the voice of Jesus, it never stopped. She didn't scream, but she was firm, persistent. It was like a pulsation inside the chest. Tell my people. How many times have I found myself on my knees before the altar, alone in the middle of the night, begging God for direction? How many nights have I spent awake, staring at the ceiling, asking for signs, asking for confirmation, asking for Him to speak again? And every time I prayed, I felt the same presence, the same warmth, the same certainty that it wasn't a dream. It was not an illusion. It was not an invention. The hardest thing of all was not having seen what I saw. The hardest part was carrying that without being able to share it. It was knowing that I had an urgent message, a heavenly truth, and not knowing how to deliver it. Because I know the institution, I know the protocols, I know the fear that many have of the supernatural when it escapes theological control. And if I spoke, what would happen to me? And if I remained silent, what would happen to those who needed to hear? This was the internal war that tore me apart. Obey Christ or protect my reputation. Honor the call or remain silent to maintain my position. The choice seemed impossible, but something inside me already knew. When Jesus speaks, silence is disobedience. Have you ever felt this? Have you ever felt that God asked you something too big? Something that you yourself doubted you could accomplish? Have you ever been paralyzed between, what if it works? And what if they destroy me for this? If you've been to this place, then you understand. Because obeying heaven almost always means confronting the earth. And at that moment in history, I still had no idea of everything that was yet to come, but something told me that my life and my faith would never be the same again. And you? Have you ever been through something so intense that you were afraid to tell it? Have you ever received something in prayer that didn't seem to fit in the world? Tell me here in the comments. Let's walk together, because what comes now will touch us deeply. And you need to be here to listen. The days that followed were marked by deafening silence. The black notebook was full of notes, like a prophetic diary that burned in my hands. I knew I couldn't keep it to myself, but the fear continued to gnaw at me. The voice of Jesus echoed firmly in my spirit. Tell my people. But the reality of the world around me seemed increasingly hostile to anything involving supernatural experiences, spiritual revelations, or heavenly warnings. Even so, something inside me had already been awakened, and when the soul is touched by Christ Himself, there is no returning to normality. I took a deep breath and decided to take the first step. I arranged a conversation with two fellow priests, men with whom I have shared many celebrations, confessions, and advice over the years. They were brothers in the priesthood, educated, spiritually zealous men, at least as far as the eye could see. I sincerely hoped that they would listen to me with their hearts, let them realize the seriousness of what I was about to share. But I barely finished the first story, and I saw the silent judgment in their eyes. One of them had his arms crossed, looking at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. The other shook his head slowly, as if regretting what he was hearing. When I mentioned that I had seen Jesus and that He had given me a specific message about the Church and Pope Francis, there was absolute silence, until one of them broke the tension with a cold and direct comment. "Antonio, are you sure that wasn't just your brain trying to find comfort at the time of death?" I tried to argue. He said there were details, emotions, revelations that could never have been manufactured by the mind. I spoke about the visions, the words of Jesus, the light, but they were no longer listening. They had already formed their opinions. And there, at that moment, I realized that spiritual rejection hurts much more than any bodily illness. Weeks later, I took the issue to a regional bishop, someone I deeply respected and believed to be sensitive to the things of the Spirit. I went with an open heart, willing to be confronted, but also expecting acceptance. I told you everything from start to finish, and at the end of the story, he looked me in the eyes with a serious expression and said, "Father Antonio, don't confuse delirium with revelation." Those words tore me up inside. I heard each syllable as if it were a sentence. There was no empathy, there was no listening, there was no discernment. There was only disbelief and a clear attempt to silence me. He added, "You are a respected priest with years of service. Don't waste everything, stay silent, forget about it." And when I asked, "What if it's from God?" he just sighed and looked away. I left that room with a weight on my shoulders that seemed to crush my soul. It was like every door was closing around me. And the worst thing of all is that this was not external persecution. It was internal rejection, inside the house itself, within the church itself. For those who should recognize the shepherd's voice, I returned home devastated. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What to do with all that? How can I continue living my mission with a calling burning inside and at the same time being treated like a crazy person by my own brothers of faith? The family, when they found out, also reacted with caution. My brothers, practicing Catholics, called me worried. One of my sisters came to visit me and said with tears in her eyes, "Please don't expose your reputation. You have always been the pride of our family. Have you ever thought about what they will say about you?" I tried to explain that it wasn't a choice, that I had been touched in a way that I couldn't deny, but she just held my hand and said, "You can believe what you saw, but you don't have to tell everyone. Keep this with you. It's safer that way." That day after she left, I sat before the altar of the small oratory I had set up at home. The candles were lit. The Bible was open to Psalm 27. "Even if my father and mother abandon me, the Lord will welcome me." That word came in like a balm, but it didn't erase the pain of loneliness, because it's one thing to know that God is with you. Another is feeling completely isolated from men. It was a profound spiritual loneliness. It wasn't physical. It was something that went through the chest and hurt invisibly. I looked up to the sky and said, "Lord, I obey, but I don't want to walk alone." And maybe right now someone on the other side of the screen is feeling this way too. Alone, misunderstood, questioned by his own family, by his own friends, perhaps even by spiritual leaders. Maybe you experienced something supernatural, something that marked you, but that no one believes. If this is your case, comment here. Talk to me. Because the loneliness of the soul is something that God never ignores, and what comes next in this story shows that heaven never abandons those who decide to obey, even when the whole world turns its back. Are you ready to continue? So hold on tight, because the journey is just beginning. A year has passed, an entire year in silence, carrying within me a truth that burned more every day. The black notebook was kept in the bottom drawer of the desk, covered in cloth and paper, as if that were capable of containing what was written there. But it wasn't the paper that burned, it was my soul. Because when Jesus gives you a message, it's not like an opinion that you may or may not share, it's a flame, an urgency, a cry from heaven within your spirit. And there comes a time when you can no longer remain silent. During that year, I lived as a divided man. On the outside, I was the same priest. I celebrated masses, heard confessions, attended to the sick, preached sermons. But inside, something had changed. I could no longer listen to the liturgy without remembering the words Jesus said to me. Every time I looked at the faithful, my heart broke. They didn't know, and I wasn't telling them. It was like I was betraying them out of fear, out of cowardice, out of human respect. It was on an ordinary night, one of those nights when the world sleeps and the sky seems closer to the earth, that I finally understood. It was no longer a question of if I would speak. It was a question of how. Because I no longer had a choice. It was obedience or a mission. And at that moment there in the silence of my room in front of the same crucifix that had accompanied me for so many years, I said, "Lord, if you commanded it, then give me strength. I don't know what will happen after this, but I will no longer hide what I saw." I took out my cell phone. Simple, old, camera with reasonable quality, but sufficient. I placed it on a stack of books, adjusted the lamplight, took a deep breath, and pressed the record button. No script, no plan. Just me, my voice, and the truth. And I started talking. I spoke as if I were confessing my soul, as if each word was a brick removed from the walls of fear. I told him what happened that morning when I fell in front of the altar. I described the hospital, the feeling of leaving the body, the encounter with Jesus. I spoke about light, about love, about the message. I told everything, including the most delicate. What he said about the church, about the Pope, about the spiritual state of the world. My hands were shaking, my heart was beating fast, but my voice was steady, because at that moment I knew I wasn't talking to myself. Jesus was with me. It was as if he himself breathed each sentence. At the end of the video, I took a long pause. I looked at the cell phone lens, as if I were looking directly into the eyes of each person who would one day click there. And I said, with all the serenity that was in me, I'm not against the Pope, I'm not against anyone, but what Jesus told me to say, I can't remain silent. I uploaded the video discreetly, without fuss. I created a new channel, without my name, no ties to the parish. Just one title, The Truth I Received from the Other Side. I pressed the publish button and gave it to God. I thought no one would see. I thought it would go unnoticed, like so many other forgotten videos on the internet. But within hours, everything began to change. First were the comments, silent, shy, but full of weight. I cried listening to that. I felt the presence of God like never before. I don't know this man, but what he says confirms what I've felt in my heart for years. Then came the shares, and in 3 days the video had already surpassed 100,000 views. People all over the world started writing, simple people, cultured people, Catholics, evangelicals, even people who said they had no religion, all saying the same thing. That message woke me up. I needed to hear that. Now I understand what the Spirit was already trying to show me. It didn't take long for a real community to start forming around that video. People thirsty for truth. Wounded people but willing to be healed. People who were reunited with God after hearing that testimony. And me, I watched everything with tears in my eyes. Not because I was seeking approval, but because I finally understood that message wasn't just mine. She belonged to the people. And the people recognize when heaven speaks, even if it comes in a simple way, even if it doesn't have the seal of an institution. The Spirit testifies in the heart of what comes from God. With each comment, with each new testimony sent, my spirit was filled with reverence and also of fear, because what had started with a simple click was now a wave, a spiritual current forming, a spark that began to turn into a flame. And I knew that this flame wasn't just mine. She was for everyone who feels like something is happening, for those with spiritual eyes, for those who feel the sky move even when the earth seems confused. And have you ever felt this? Have you ever been sure that something is being awakened within you, even without being able to explain it? Have you ever been moved by a video, a word, a song, as if God were speaking just to you? Comment here. Talk to me. Because what started in that video is still just beginning. And the next part of the story is even more intense. Stay with me, because you need to hear what came next. The growth of it all was as rapid as it was unexpected. The video that I recorded without planning, without editing, without any pretension, continued to spread like wildfire. Messages arrived every day, from everywhere. People who said they had returned to prayer after years away. People who had never felt anything spiritual in their lives, but who, when watching, were overcome by an emotion they couldn't explain. There were even those who reported visions, dreams, signs. And they all said the same thing. Father, this message came at the right time. I needed to hear it. It was as if the Holy Spirit was touching souls, one by one, through that simple, homemade, but genuine recording. Little by little, a real community began to form. It was not an organized movement without statute or headquarters. It was something spiritual. People who began to meet virtually to pray, share experiences, study the scriptures, cry out for discernment, a rebirth of faith. And I, who before felt so alone, now found myself surrounded by an invisible crowd of awakened hearts. There was something alive there, something real, something that only those who have been touched by God can understand. And that gave me the strength to continue, even though I knew the challenges were just beginning. The church, of course, soon learned about the video. Some priests got in touch asking for explanations. Others just walked away in silence. But what surprised me was the number of lay people, many of them I never imagined, coming to me in secret saying, Father, I believe in you. A deacon told me, I also had a vision, but I never had the courage to tell it. A catechist revealed, since I was a child, I have dreamed of Jesus telling me that the church was going to go through a great shake. Hearing these testimonies was like putting together pieces of a celestial puzzle. I understood that God was not just talking to me. He was waking up the body of Christ, and I was just one of the trumpets. But it wasn't all glory. The attacks also came. Aggressive comments, accusations of being a heretic, a liar, a manipulator. Some said I wanted fame, others that I was mentally ill. There were those who said I was an instrument of the devil trying to sow division. It hurt, very, but I already expected it. Jesus said that those who carry his truth would be persecuted. And now I understood this verse with a new depth. Because when you speak the truth that heaven delivers to you, it does not please earthly powers. She bothers, she shakes, she exposes. Still, I followed, and he continued writing, no longer in the black notebook, but now in a new diary, because God kept talking. Not in the same way as that day in the light, but through the scriptures, through deep prayer, through dreams, and the Spirit gave me direction. Keep teaching, keep warning, keep loving. And that's what I did. I created new videos, always with humility, always with reverence, always making it clear, I am not against anyone, but I am in favor of obedience to Christ. I repeated this countless times, because it was not about attacking the Pope, nor about discrediting the Church. It was a calling, a summons from heaven, a correction in love, a prophetic cry that said, return to your first love. And how many times as I prayed through all of this, did I find myself remembering the voice of Jesus, Francis needs to hear. And I understood that perhaps it wasn't just the Pope, but each one of us. Because we all drift away, we all need to listen and come back. The flame was lit, and even though the wind tried to erase it, it grew, it burned, it transformed. I was no longer the same priest. He was no longer the same man. Something had changed forever, but the strongest thing of all it is that I knew. It wasn't about me, it never was. It was about Jesus, about the calling, about the truth. And this truth continues to echo. If you felt something in this video, if something inside moved, even if you can't explain it, don't ignore it. God speaks in many ways. Sometimes he uses the unlikely. Sometimes he chooses what has been rejected. Sometimes he speaks just when you think he is silent. If you've listened this far, it's because this is for you too. Comment below, I receive this truth, and share this video with someone who needs to wake up. If you've come this far with an open heart, it's because this message spoke to you in some way. So now I want to ask you something very simple but very important. Subscribe to the channel. This helps me to continue bringing messages like this, real testimonies, near-death experiences, spiritual revelations, and words that touch the soul. Also take advantage and leave a like on this video. This shows YouTube that this content is relevant and it can reach even more people who are thirsty for something from heaven, just like you. Now click on the next video that is appearing here on the screen, because what you will see there could be exactly what your spirit has been waiting for a long time. There's something special waiting for you, and I feel like you won't want to miss it. I'll meet you there. May God bless you deeply.